मामा मैं मम्मी का මම මේක වහන්න ඔෆ් කරන්න එපාද මේක නෑ මට මේ මගේ ලෙක්චර් එක දාන්න මම මේක පොඩ්ඩක් මේ පහත් කරන්න කමක් නැද්ද මේ controversies in controversies in managing snake bite මේකට හරියටම කියන්න controversies in the management of snake bite professor in parasitology තාම මම professor of field වෙන්නේ නැහැ professor of කියන්නේ මේ chair card chair professor මම merit professor ඔව් ඔව් chair එක්කෙනාට අපේ තාම chair එකක් නැහැ මම chair එකට apply කරලා නැහැ parasitology රජරට medical science and senior research fellow Monash fellow of fellow කියන්නේ of කියන එකක් නෑ fellow ඊට පස්සේ මගේ affiliation එක කියන්නේ Monash at the hari at the Monash Monash first ඊට පස්සේ national oh ඊට අමතරව national ඊට පස්සේ ඔන්න දැන් topic එකට related national snake bite expert committee එකේ member දැන් for nearly 7 years ඒකම අන්තිමට කිව්වා ඔව් පෙරාදිනේ oh MPhil පෙරාදිනේ PhD Monash from Peradeniya PhD Monash හරි ඒක කොහොමද හිටපු අනිත් ජෙන්ටල්මන් කතා කරේ තියා මේ ඔක්කොම නිකන් මෙතන prestigious पुन्हा निकाल अरे में snake bite related research science क्या करला तीन वासा he has delivered several innovations. Mage misma onnan demmana gare demmana mage tienane 50 දැනට already තියෙන 50 full papers එහෙම දැම්මත් ඒත් කම research නැත්නම් over 50 මේ research papers තියෙනවා කියලා දැම්මම එහෙම කියන්නේ ඒ usually මේ වගේ ඉච්චර කියන්නේ operation වල ඉච්චර වුණා හිල්ස් නැත්නම් he's a member of the National Snake Bite Expert Committee of Sri Lanka Medical Association. Expert Committee. Of Sri Lanka Medical Association of SLM. Yeah, I think operation. Happy to hear. कॉपी करें
कॉपी करें
ना मैं कॉपी करना
कमान है डेस्कटॉप पे बंदा
करने गया कंट्रोवर्सी नहीं खाली
नहीं ना सर
फंड
पेन
Good morning, everybody. I welcome you all on behalf of the KSM for the CME lecture. Before I start, I would like to mention some upcoming events. We are having a health camp on the 1st, that is tomorrow, at Thangapur in the Knuckles range. And also we are having the foundation sessions on the 7th October at Oakley Hotel. Coming to the today's event topic. The topic is controversies in the management of snake bite. Today's speaker is Professor Anjana Silva. He is professor in parasitology at Rajarata University Medical Faculty and senior research fellow at the Monash University, Australia. Anjana is no strange outsider to our society. He graduated from Peradeniya University and he did his MPhil also at Peradeniya and PhD from Monash University, Australia. He has several publications and he has done several orations also. He is a member of the Snake Bite Expert Committee of the Sri Lanka Medical Association. So I invite Anjana to come and Professor Anjana to come and share his experience with us.
Okay, very good morning to you all. Thank you very much, Dr. Kavinda, one of my good friends for a long time and also a senior colleague. Okay, now, first, I should declare that I have no conflicts of interest because I will be talking about antivenom, sometimes comparing brands and so on. So I have no conflicts of interest and any affiliation to any commercial antivenom producers. So now, when I talk about controversies in managing snake bite, you might wonder. Now we have only one antivenom. That is the only treatment. And when a patient comes, it's just a matter of deciding whether to give antivenom or not. So what is there? There's nothing to be worried about, or there's no such controversy you might think. Now, unfortunately, it's a bit different from the reality. So now we know in our usual practice guidelines, the knowledge for the practice guidelines usually come from research. So research-based evidence. Now, based on the evidence generated from research, then people talk about evidence-based practice. Now, in our usual the evidence hierarchy in medicine. Now, this is the pyramid of evidence, quality of evidence. So, right at the bottom or the lowest quality evidence comes from expert opinions or background information, and then case series, case reports provide bit better sort of analysis of information, and then case control studies, and then prospective studies like cohort studies provide even more better information. But what we usually our consensus is that randomized control trials provide the best assessment, especially regarding the management practices, treatments, so on. And then not only that, people do things like systematic reviews and meta-analysis, where they in areas where lots of randomized controls are there, they actually critically evaluate randomized control trials and see how their trials are conducted, and then based on that, actually they give various judgments on the results of randomized control trials. So the at the highest point, the evidence comes from meta-analysis and systematic reviews. But snake bite, the field of snake bite is not so lucky. There are not many properly conducted research, especially on interventions. So lack of research-based evidence has resulted in lots of expert opinions that have directly come into practice for a long time. Now this has been a big issue, and the term expert opinion is again vague because there's no measure of expertise. Now, for example, say in a European country, a toxicologist who might be for his entire life he might be seeing 30 snake bites for the entire service, whereas someone in teaching hospital Anuradhapura might be seeing in 1 week they are seeing 30 snake bite cases. So the expertise again might differ. But unfortunately, most of the practices we do at the moment are based on expert opinions, and now we are trying to do research to see whether they are valid or not. So we'll start with a simple case. Now, a 38-year-old farmer bitten by a Russell's viper. Now, this was a specimen confirmed one, was admitted to ETU of Teaching Hospital Anuradhapura 1.5 hours after the bite. And on admission, mild local swelling and pain, no clinical evidence of any systemic envenoming, no bleeding manifestations, and whole blood clotting time 20 was negative. So what are we going to do? Now this is a confirmed Russell's viper bite, mild swelling, local swelling, and whole blood clotting time 20 negative, no other systemic features. Now, in this case, they waited for 2 hours and did another whole blood clotting time 20, and this time it was positive, and at that same time patient was having abdominal pain and nausea as well, no bleeding manifestations. So what is the next step? Are you going to start antivenom? Okay, so this time patient received 20 vials of Indian polyethylene antivenom, and then anaphylactic reaction occurred. and patient was resuscitated, and but then patient was having hypotension, and with 400 drops, it's still 75/50. Now patient was then transferred to ICU, and at the same time, now the INR comes. INR is 2.2. Now is that alarming for you? Like, INR of 2.2. Now the patient is not having any bleeding signs. Okay. Then 6 hours after the first antivenom dose, they repeated the whole blood clotting time 20. Right? It was still positive. And INR was again 2.2. Right? No bleeding manifestations or any other clinically detectable features of NRM. So now, what is your idea? We have given antivenom to 3.5 hours after the bite, right? And but patient is still having coagulopathy. So how do you see this? Indian antivenom was ineffective for Russell Swipe bites in Sri Lanka. Antivenom was given too late. Antivenom dose was inadequate. Can't be a problem with antivenom, but something else. Oh, no idea. Okay, we'll discuss that with bit of basic sciences, and then we'll move into this is just to kind of like arouse your critical analysis, and then we'll go for the discussion later. There's another case. This time it's a crate bite patient. So this lady was brought to the ETU 1.5 hours after the bite of a Indian crate, and the specimen confirmed. And this is the photograph I took on admission. So patient was having bilateral ptosis and ophthalmoplegia, but no other problems. She was not having bulbar paralysis or no respiratory difficulty, right? But because there's neurotoxicity on admission, she was quickly given 20 vials of Indian polyvalent antivenom. But despite giving Indian polyvalent antivenom, 1.5 hours later, patient developed respiratory paralysis. Now this time, how do you analyze this? You gave antivenom early, but patient went into severe paralysis. What do you think? Antivenom ineffective, given too late, amount was inadequate, can't be a problem with antivenom? No idea. Any ideas? Okay. Now let's move into the third case. So this time it's a 32-year-old female presented 30 minutes after hump nose swipe bite. Now these are real cases, right? On admission, there's moderate local swelling and whole blood clotting time 20 was negative. It was repeated 1.5 hours later, and this time it was positive. Now this is a confirmed hump nose swipe bite case. No bleeding manifestations. What are you going to do now? So this positive whole blood clotting time in hump nose, confirmed hump nose swipe bite case. Are you going to give antivenom? No. Then what are you going to do? Okay. So they actually did not give antivenom and observed, and 2 hours later a repeat whole blood clotting time was done, and it was positive. At the same time, they got the INR results. INR was very high. So now it's over 13. That means like probably there's absolutely no clotting. So severe coagulopathy, but still no bleeding. Now this time what are you going to do? Giving antivenom? Any therapeutic approaches? If you look at the SLMA guidelines for snake bite management, what they suggest is for hump nose swipers, you can give FFP, right? So those with positive whole blood protein count 20 for specific therapy FFP, right? So what they have suggested, I refer there, but actually I'm also a member of the committee. But the guideline says FFP should be given, right? So in this case, FFP was given. So this is just a timeline here. FFP was given at 5.5 hours after the bite, and then after 4 hours they did INA again, and INA again 30, and then rechecked INA at 14 hours after the bite, again 13, very high. So that they then thought of giving another dose of FFP. So FFP repeated, and after 24 hours, still INA was 30. Now, definitely two FFP doses actually did not work. But gradually, then patient improved, and on 72 hours, INA was normal. So FFP had failed to restore coagulation. Why? Now let's see a bit of theory. Now, to have a formal introduction, now snake bite is a serious public health concern across the tropics, especially Southeast Asia, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. It's a major problem. Asia alone actually contributes to about 2/3 of the snake bite burden in the world. And Sri Lanka records one of the highest snake bite incidence rates, nearly 400 snake bites per 100,000 population per year, which is one of the highest snake bite affected countries. So we often talk about acute effects of snake envenoming, which we are very familiar of, but we don't really speak of long-term effects because they are less studied. So there are lots of long-term effects as well, like disabilities due to amputations and so on, psychological effects, blindness, and so on. Now, in this lecture, to avoid any confusions, I would like to introduce, be clear with some terms. Now, poisoning and envenoming means in two different ways, right? So they are not equal. So you can't apply snake bite poisoning. It's a wrong term. Should be snake bite envenoming. Poisoning means like you have to eat the poisonous substance to get poison, right? Basically, if you eat the snake and you die, then it's a poisonous snake bite by you. You bit the snake. So it's a matter of who bites, right? So in envenoming, the venomous animal bites you, right? So snake bite, it's always envenoming, not poisoning. Also in literature, people use envenoming and envenomation, both means similar. Envenoming in British English, envenomation in American English, right? So now my whole point is trying to prove that what makes snakebite management a unique, complex toxicological issue. Now, first thing we need to understand is snake venom is not a single substance, single bioactive substance. Now, for example, if you see paracetamol poisoning, it's a single bioactive substance, right? But snake bite, it differs because snake venom is a cocktail of hundreds of different toxins with different pharmacological actions, right? So it's just a mixture with various substances which have different pharmacological actions. Now, this is a venom composition of Indian crate venom. So you can see there are these different colors indicate different groups of toxins. So the ones that contribute to paralysis is the one with turquoise color, right? Beta Bunker toxin, beta chain complex. That is the one actually causes paralysis. The rest of the things we don't know what they do. So they are actually quite complex. The venoms are quite complex. Now, the other thing is this venom composition is not fixed. Even within a species, it varies. Baby snake, their venom composition might be vary or might change in great detail or great extent when they become large or adults, right? That's an ontogenic variation. And males and female venoms, they might differ. So there's a huge variation in venom. So sometimes, like in certain snakes, there may be more neurotoxins compared to hemotoxins, so that they will give a clinical picture in the after bite according to the venom composition. So it varies. And the other thing is, because there are lots of toxins involved, they have different pharmacokinetics. So for example, now after a bite, on the bite site, venom toxins gradually absorb into the circulation. Now the rate at which they appear in the circulation differs, and the elimination differs. So this is a very dynamic situation after envenoming, because some toxins take time to appear into the circulation, whereas some appear quite fast, right? And then the redistribution. Now, once they appear in the circulation, some toxins, their site of action, like for example, the ones involved in coagulopathy, their site of action is central compartment. But neurotoxics, they have to distribute into neuromuscular junctions to give toxic effect. So they take time sometimes, right? So they all differ. Now, what you see as clinical features in a patient lying on a bed is actually just a snapshot of the series of events happening, and the situation evolves, right, according to the different rates. Now remember, now this again might change according to the depth of the bite. Sometimes, like if a bite is directly intramuscularly, most of the toxins will quickly appear in circulation, whereas some, if it is entirely subcutaneous, it will take a bit more time. And so we have seen direct intravenous bites, where like the snake has, Russell's viper has directly bitten over a vein, where patient usually get completely different clinical features. So that also differs. And the second thing is the poorly understood pathophysiology. Now, for example, now again with paracetamol. Now paracetamol, whether it happens in Sri Lanka or US or wherever, we know that the pathophysiology, what is the active ingredient, and what is the active metabolite which damages liver, we all know. But here it's different, because we have very poor knowledge on the pathophysiology of different envenoming syndromes. Now, for example, coagulopathy. Now, although we call coagulopathy in snake envenoming, the correct term should be venom-induced consumption coagulopathy, because it's a consumption coagulopathy. It's not an anticoagulant coagulopathy, it's a consumption coagulopathy. So here is the clotting cascade. And so you can see, now the ones in green are actually different venom toxins that activate the clotting cascade. Now, if you take Russell's viper as an example, Russell's viper has factor 10 and factor 5 activators. So these toxins activate the inactive form of factor 5 and factor 10, and then the subsequent pathway is gradually activated, leading to widespread conversion of fibrinogen to fibrin. But this is a bit different. It does not readily make clots. This happens slowly in a widespread manner, so that gradually all the clotting factors downstream as well as fibrinogen consume, right? But there's no obvious clot forming, and the fibrinolytic pathways get activated, and they degrade the form fibrin. So D-dimer levels go up. That's what happens. So this is a slow consumption of clotting factors, but there's no obvious clot forming. Now, for hump-nosed vipers, they have toxins similar to thrombin-like enzymes, and then saw-scale vipers, they have prothrombin activators. So different snakes have different toxins that target different sites of clotting cascade. So accordingly, you get coagulopathy. So this is just clotting studies of 146 patients. Now these graphs show different parameters. This is INR, this is APTT, fibrinogen, factor 5, factor 10. The interrupted line indicates the venom level of the patient, and the solid line indicate different parameters. What you can see is, now here in this first one, INR, you can see the venom level quickly goes up, but probably after giving antivenom, rapidly it goes down. And now the venom level is low. But INR recovery does not follow venom. It takes time for INR to recover, because what is the reason? If you look at other clotting factors as well, it's the same. Fibrinogen, it takes time to improve. Factor levels takes time to improve. What is the reason? Now there's no venom here. When in this period of time, you can see there's no venom in the blood, but still coagulopathy. Why? The reason is actually antivenom or any therapeutic intervention will not replenish the consumed clotting factors. It is the liver that has to produce clotting factors, or else you have to give it from outside. You have to give FFP, right? So antivenom will not readily correct coagulation. It is the liver that has to do that job. What you see as bleeding is not entirely a result of coagulopathy, but usually in snake venoms, apart from the toxins that activate clotting cascade, they have toxins that damage the vasculature as well. We call them, most of them are metalloproteinases, enzymes, so they damage the vascular endothelium, so that on one hand there's clotting abnormality, on the other hand vascular endothelium damage, so that bleeding occurs. Now this is quite different to Australian snakes, where Australian snakes have lots of toxins that affect clotting, but they don't have toxins that affect the vascular endothelium. So it's very common to find in Australia to have patients with INR 13 but with absolutely no bleeding. So they are like sitting on a bomb until their liver produces enough clotting factors. Otherwise, if there's bleeding happens, there's no way stopping. So the key message here is coagulopathy in snake bite is due to gradual consumption of clotting factors which are activated by venom toxins, and antivenom cannot replace clotting factors. The coagulopathy doesn't resolve until the liver replaces the consumed clotting factors. Now, often in literature, people have confused this venom-induced consumption coagulopathy with disseminated intravascular coagulation. Now, if you apply DIC scores for any patient like this patient will also give a score, and people will diagnose that as DIC, but which is wrong, because pathophysiologically it's a complete different entity. Of course, high PTINR will be there, high T dimers, and hyperfibrinogenemia. The evidence is there, and sometimes platelet counts will also drop. But still, these patients don't have systemic microthrombi, they don't have microvascular occlusions, fibrin deposition cannot be observed usually, no end-organ failures, and then this is fairly rapid. Now DIC develops over days, but WIC, it develops over a couple of hours. So this, because of this, there are major changes. So in snake bite, there's no DIC. It is WIC, venom-induced consumption coagulopathy. The other thing is, now you must have sometimes like observed in some of the viper bite patients, apart from the venom-induced consumption coagulopathy, sometimes patient develop thrombocytopenia, anemia, right? And then blood picture pretty much similar to microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. So these patients are, we now treat them as thrombotic microangiopathy, but of course we know that the prototype diseases of thrombotic microangiopathy are TTP and HUS. So the snake bite envenoming, you can't categorize under TTP or HUS, because the etiology is completely different. However, what happens in snake bite patient is somewhat similar to hemolytic uremic syndrome rather than TTP. And also this, now in here, probably like patients who develop kidney injury have TTP thrombotic microangiopathy-like features usually, and also patients, if they develop hypertension, that might also aggravate the kidney injury, and also rhabdomyolysis might also aggravate kidney injury. And next pathophysiological issue is snakebite neurotoxicity. Now, snakebite neurotoxicity is entirely peripheral. It's not central. So now, if you look at the vertebrate nervous system, the central nervous system is well protected, right, with blood-brain barrier. Usually, molecules larger than 500 Dalton cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. Snake venom toxins are much larger; they can't cross blood-brain barrier. And then the peripheral neurons, peripheral nerves are also well protected with myelination. They can't cross. Only vulnerable place in the nervous system is the nerve terminal, motor nerve terminal. That is actually exposed. So that is why many organisms like spiders, snakes, bacteria, corn snails, and pufferfish, they all produce toxins targeting this weak point, the neuromuscular junction and the motor nerve terminal. If you target that place and stop neurotransmission, then you can quickly paralyze your enemy. That is the strategy in the animal world. So that is why all these animals develop toxins. So snakes are not an exception. They also target this weak link where they target the motor nerve terminal or the neuromuscular junction. Then you can quickly paralyze your enemy. So in snakes, there are two major types of toxins. One acting on the motor nerve terminal. So we call them presynaptic neurotoxins. So they actually enter into the motor nerve terminal via mechanisms we don't know yet, but they lead to a gradual inhibition of recycling of the vesicles, acetylcholine vesicles, and also then they actually damage the mitochondria as well, and structurally damage the motor nerve terminal. So motor nerve, basically, it's like these toxins make holes in the motor nerve terminal. So there's a structural damage. Now, snakes such as kraits and many Australian snakes like taipans, tiger snakes, they all have these toxins in their venom, right? Now, once these toxins damage the motor nerve terminal, it cannot be reversed by antivenom. The terminal has to repair on its own. It takes time. So what are you going to do? You have to keep the patient alive by ventilating. That's it. The motor nerve terminal will recover. And then the other group of toxins are acetylcholine antagonists. Right? We call them alpha neurotoxins. So they bind irreversibly with the acetylcholine receptor, right? And prevent acetylcholine binding, so that it leads to a neuromuscular block, right? Now, for a long time, these toxins were also considered really important clinically, but recently our studies proved that these toxins actually don't affect humans much. Humans are actually resistant for these toxins, most of these toxins. So clinically, those patients who are developing paralysis mainly get paralyzed by presynaptic neurotoxins and not by postsynaptic toxins. So the key message here is paralysis in snake bite is primarily due to the structural damage of motor nerve terminals. Antivenom cannot reverse the motor nerve terminal damage, and motor nerve terminals should repair the damage on their own, right? And that is how you see a clinical improvement. Otherwise, like sometimes what happens in the world is, now sometime back, now currently it is not the practice, but sometime back, patient comes with after a krait bite with a paralysis, and then you give antivenom, and then but patient progresses into the severe paralysis, and the next day morning patient is having still paralysis, give some antivenom, and then doesn't reverse, again do a water down, and then see, okay, maybe not enough antivenom, give another dose. But well, if you really look at the blood venom levels after the first antivenom dose, there's no blood venom levels. Antivenom already neutralized the venom levels. Now those toxins which have migrated to the motor nerve terminals, they have already started the damage, and that damage has to be repaired. Antivenom molecules, I'll explain later, they are quite large. They can't really chase behind the toxins to the motor nerve terminals, right? So that it's a matter of waiting by giving life support. That's it. You have to ventilate the patient and keep it alive. So there are patients who are on paralysis for about 7-8 days and then suddenly wake up. That is because now at the moment where they are their motor nerve terminals are repaired, they start responding. The third issue is actually the diagnosis of envenoming, which is a major challenge. Now this diagram actually reflects our Anuradhapura snakebite cohort data. The essence is that now if you look at this one, the bottom part, this is about direct admissions to Anuradhapura hospital. Patients usually direct admissions after a snake bite, they admit within median of 1 hour after the bite to the hospital. If you look at the time from admission to the first dose of antivenom, it takes 2 hours. The problem is on admissions, patients do not have signs of envenoming. And then we wait and let the patient to develop envenoming features to diagnose envenoming and then give antivenom. We have lost vital time. This is a big problem. Think about motor nerve terminal damage in neurotoxins. Where on admission, patient is okay, so you wait for patient developing paralysis. On admission, most of the neurotoxins are not on neuromuscular junction. It's on the central compartment. If you give antivenom, you can neutralize. But now you let the toxins to go into the neuromuscular junction and then give antivenom. But what to be done? We don't have any diagnostic tools. We can't do anything. We don't have diagnostic tools because antivenom is not a safe drug to play with. So that is a major issue. And the other thing is that other problem is now see venom-induced consumption coagulopathy. We mainly use that for diagnosis whole blood clotting time 20. INI is not available in all the peripheral centers, right? It's not readily available. Bleeding manifestations, well, it only occurs in severe cases only. Neuromuscular paralysis, there are no rapid diagnostic methods of neuromuscular paralysis. You have to rely on neurological features, again late. Rhabdomyolysis, again, you have to wait for clinical manifestations like myoglobinuria or so on, or creatine kinase. Acute kidney injury, again, either you have to wait for low urinary output or then blood reports. So what basically we have left with no option than to wait for appearance of clinical features which take time. So this is actually a pharmacokinetic pharmacodynamic mismatch. So first, pharmacokinetics is quite quick. Toxins absorb into the circulation, but the dynamic effects take time to develop. So it's a mismatch of timing. Now this is quite could be easily demonstrated in myotoxicity. Now in these two patients with myotoxicity, with very high serum creatine kinase levels, with very high, it's like 60,000, 40,000 like, you can see the venom concentration versus creatine kinase levels. At about 4 hours, the venom levels peak in the blood, but still creatine kinase levels are low. When the creatine kinase levels try to go up within like 48 hours, absolutely no venom in the blood. So there's this big, discrepancy of pharmacokinetics and dynamics. We have lost the window of opportunity. So this is again because of the lack of diagnostics. The ideal way should be, if we have a diagnostic test that can detect the presence of venom in blood readily, then that would be much beneficial. So one of my MPhil students recently did a review on bedside coagulation tests used worldwide. And what we found was that the whole blood bedside clotting tests, such as whole blood clotting time test used widely, they are also not standardized. Now these are few studies that that were done in Sri Lanka as well as by us, right? In whole blood clotting time 20, you can see the sensitivity is very low, 40%, 54%, 70%. Now this is a study done by us. Now the INR cutoff was 3 for 70% sensitivity, INR cutoff was 1.5 for 54% sensitivity. So basically, if you see coagulopathy of INR 1.5, whole blood protein time misses half of the patients. But it has a good specificity. So if it is positive, it is likely that patients are absolutely having coagulopathy. But if it is negative, you can't exclude envelope. So we are dealing with a very poor screening tool. That is the other problem. Now, screening tools, sensitivity should be high. But here, sensitivity is around 50%. So it is like, tossing a coin or something like that. So very poor, right? And on the other important thing is now, Smith et al. Did a study by doing whole blood clotting time by a trained staff member using new glass tubes, right? With a standard method. So there they described that the sensitivity was improved up to 82%. So at least in the usual ward setup, if you are doing whole blood clotting time 20, should be done with new clean glass tubes, 5 ml glass tubes. You put 1 ml of blood into it, leave it untouched. After 20 minutes, try to tip over and then see whether blood is clotted. If you use all penicillin bottles with detergents and all sorts of different glassware, then the results must be really weird, right? So then diagnosis of paralysis, as I said, entirely clinical. We tried using single fiber electromyography for research purposes, and Professor Vajraveer Singh also did in organophosphate poisoning patients, I guess. So for snake bites, we did about in about 250 patients. These are actually more advanced EMG techniques, but they are good only for research. You can't do it for day-to-day clinical practice. Now, these tests, according to our studies, they were quite beneficial in predicting impending paralysis. So when a patient comes to the ward, we did single fiber EMG, and EMG shows big abnormalities, but the patient is having no paralysis. And then gradually patient move into clinically detectable paralysis. So they are quite good, but not practical. And the other important thing is there are certain few important clinical signs you often miss that are really important. Now, over the years, what people have observed is features of non-specific systemic envenoming are really important in predicting systemic envenoming. For example, abdominal pain in Russell's fiber bites, crate bites. Usually, if a patient presents with that, chances are high that the patient is going to develop envenoming later on. But there are many clinicians with much experience. They might even suggest in patients with envenoming in Russell's viper as well as crates, they usually complain abdominal pain quite early. And also we did a large study in Anuradhapura with 600 patients. Again, what we found was that the sensitivity although the sensitivity was low in abdominal pain, still specificity was high. So if a patient comes and there's no coagulopathy, whole blood clotting time negative, but still complains of abdominal pain, it's an important sign that the patient will probably develop coagulopathy later on. And also when we combine abdominal pain with headache and vomiting, the specificity was already like close to 100. So very specific. So that you can keep in mind. And also, I think it's for the recent snakebite management guidelines of SLMA, they have included that in no demonstrable coagulopathy, negative whole blood clotting time 20, but proven Russell's fiber bite with fan marks, abdominal pain, and some local effects such as swelling, or in the presence of any more systemic effects such as visual disturbances, dizziness, and so on, you can give antivenom, which is, I guess, really important. Even in crates, if severe abdominal pain in the absence of neurotoxicity, you can give antivenom. So if a patient presents with non-specific features of envenoming such as abdominal pain, headache, and vomiting, chances are very high that the patient could develop severe envenoming. The fourth one is we have only one specific treatment of snake bite. We don't have many options, just antivenom. Antivenoms are polyclonal antibodies of animal origin, right? Developed in horse, camel, even chicken, egg embryos, goats, and so on, right? So they can be monovalent, maybe that is targeting one snake species, or targeting several snake species. We call polyvalent, right? Now, antivenom, biggest problem is we actually don't know the limitations of antivenom. It's not a problem of antivenom, it's a problem of our understanding of antivenom. Now, once after a snake bite, from the bite site, gradually the toxins are absorbed into circulation. And then, before you do any intervention, some of the toxins even reach the target sites, such as neuromuscular junction. Now you give antivenom to the central compartment. According to the ability of the antivenom molecules to bind with the toxins in the central compartment, they will bind and entrap the toxins within the central compartment, preventing them moving to the target tissues, right? And they will prevent, most probably, consumption of further clotting factors as well. So the antivenom's action is central. It won't chase behind toxins. Might be able to go, but very unlikely, because now if you look at the molecular size, toxins are very small, about 10 times smaller than antivenom molecules. So if you think of a toxin acting on a neuromuscular junction, if you give antivenom, it's very difficult for antivenom molecules to reach neuromuscular junctions that fast. So there are two pharmacological terms, efficacy and effectiveness, when it comes to antivenom, right? So efficacy is ability of antivenom molecules to bind with venom toxins in vitro, outside, right? Effectiveness is the clinical effectiveness, where you see it as a reversal of patients' clinical toxicity features, right? So there can be antivenoms with good efficacy. They are good in binding with venom toxins outside, but they may not lead to a good clinical effectiveness because of the pathophysiology. If you give antivenom when the patient's target sites are already attacked by the toxins, you can't do anything. Antivenom is good, but unable to go to that site or unable to reverse the already started process, right? So it's not a problem of antivenom, it's a problem of our understanding of antivenom. Now, unfortunately, antivenom was actually developed 1895, quite long time ago. The first antivenom was developed by Albert Calmet. So this is the same person who was involved in developing BCG vaccine. So now, until now, all the antivenoms developed, the protocols are slightly changed only after even 125 years, right? Antivenom technology, development of antivenom technology actually has not developed over the last 125 years because the market is very small and snake bite happens in poor countries. So the market is very small and it's not a rich man's disease. So the technology behind antivenom development is still in a very primitive stage. So that is one reason why we don't have good antivenoms. So and the other important thing is, now you give antivenom for neurotoxic patients, coagulopathy patients, but when we did systematic reviews, what we found was, in the entire world, there are no randomized controls done to see whether antivenom has any effect for coagulopathy or neurotoxicity. So basically, we are using the drug without any trials. Now but it has become a standard practice. Now you can't do trials like, you can't do placebo-controlled trials for Russell bite patients. One group receiving antivenom and one group receiving placebo. You can't do that because it's the standard practice now. But there are no evidence. But what is important is, no evidence does not mean no effect. So there are effects. There could be effects. There should be effects actually, but it's not proven. And the other important issue is, we all know that antivenoms are notoriously associated with severe adverse reactions. And the interesting thing is, we did a recent study and we found that there's huge variation in the inter-batch variation when it comes to the antivenom reactions. So there are certain batches of certain brands which gives high reaction rates, whereas some with low reaction. So they call about anti-venom standardization. What we really suggest is do a batch-wise standardization. Otherwise, like before sending into the market, you have to do a batch-wise safety assessment, because there are certain batches which gives rise to nearly about 70% of anaphylactic reactions in certain antivenom batches what we have identified. And also the content of antivenom vials, again, along batches it varies. Some batches with high protein levels or high antibody levels, some batches with low antibody levels. So unfortunately, we are getting Indian products. That is the only available option for us when it's they are economical as well. But unfortunately, content we are not quite sure. When we analyzed the content, now one interesting thing was in an earlier study led by Kalnamadhu, what we found was most antivenoms, now antivenoms are antibodies. So nearly 100% of the powder should be protein. Unfortunately, about like 18 to 30% is the range of protein content in vials. So the rest we don't know. We couldn't analyze. So the key message is the primary action site of antivenom is circulation. You are targeting the circulation, and your target should be giving antivenom as early as possible so that whatever the toxins in the circulation should be trapped before them being moved away to the target site. That should be the action. And antivenom molecules don't chase behind toxins. So they are not magic bullets. They can't chase behind the toxins and attack. They just like drunken people wandering in a room, whereas they hit, accidentally hit a wall or something like that. When they hit the toxin, they will bind. So it is not like chasing behind and neutralizing. Now we'll quickly come back to the cases at the end. So the first case, it was a patient on admission had whole blood clotting time negative, right? But there was mild local pain. 2 hours later, antivenom 20 vials was given. This is a resuscitation by the patient, right? And patient developed a reaction, and still the coagulopathy did not resolve, right? After 6 hours, according to the guidelines, did whole blood clotting time 20. Again, it was positive. INR was 2.2, right? What is going to be done? Now, this practice of checking whole blood clotting time 26 hours and giving antivenom was initiated not based on a research. It was the earliest publication we were able to trace was in 1977, where in the discussion the author suggested maybe it's better to check every 6 hours and give some antivenom again and again, and then it became like a statement of divine statement, and then people kept on following. Now it's very difficult to get it from the management guidelines. However, now in our guidelines, we were able to amend it to a certain extent. Now we discussed the pathology. It's the liver that takes time to produce clotting factors, right? So in our guidelines, what we have suggested is give 20 vials first, right? And then recheck whole blood clotting time 20 in 6 hours. If positive, give only 10 vials. And then again, you can repeat another 10 vials. So maximum 40, right? But I really believe that with more evidence, again, this number will be revised or shortened, because according to our studies, what we did, we measured the venom levels in resuscited patients. Even the highest possible venom level in the blood can be neutralized by 14 vials of Indian polyvalent antivenom when we calculated according to the pharmacokinetic calculations, right? 14 vials should be enough for the highest possible venom levels in the blood. So giving AVS for a patient with of INR 2.2 at a cost of huge or severe anaphylactic reaction, is it worthwhile? Now in this patient we gave antivenom for INR 2.2 week. Is it worthwhile? Now I don't know. I'm not a physician, so INR 2.2, is it alarming for you? Like in the ward setting. But here it's a bit difficult to comment because sometimes antivenom must have prevented further developing of kidney failure or something like that. We don't know. So anyway, we have to go on with that. But we don't know whether it's useful or not because we haven't done any trials. And in the case 2, right, patient was given antivenom early, but despite that, patient went into respiratory paralysis. We did an interesting study in Anuradhapura based on 33 cases of trade bites. 17 patients developed severe paralysis. Now this graph is really important. This is, we call it nodal plot, where in the x-axis, the time, y-axis, the evolution of paralysis. So bottom at the y-axis is ptosis, and gradually when you go up in the axis, the severity of the paralysis increases. Each line represents a patient. And events marked in red color are pre-antivenom events. Black color ones are post-antivenom. Now you can see in all these patients, when they present to the hospital and given antivenom, they had mild neurotoxicity. But with time, despite giving antivenom, they have progressed into the severe paralysis. And if you look at the venom levels of these patients, when the patients on admission, patients were having high venom levels. But with the first dose of antivenom, quickly the venom levels gone down. So basically, when the patients were developing severe paralysis, there's no venom in the blood, right? So this, and also when we did the single fiber EMG on admission, severe, patients with severe respiratory paralysis who on admission actually had high jitter. So if we had, if we can detect these patients early and give antivenom, we could have prevented that. Otherwise, in usual time scale that we give antivenom, what antivenom can do is, antivenom can bind and trap the toxins in the circulation, prevent them going further into neuromuscular junctions. That's it, right? So I'm not saying antivenom is useless. It's useful to prevent further damage, but it will not actually reverse the paralysis. So there's no point of giving antivenom again and again if you give first dose. Based on our pharmacokinetic calculations, it's like 10 vials is more than enough, but initial dose 20 vials is what is practiced in Anuradhapura. So they give 20 vials and that's it. No repeats. Just only 20 vials what they give. So this is the publication. So the key message is persistent paralysis in trade bite patients is not because of inadequate AVS, but the nature of presynaptic neurotoxicity. And the last case. This is a 32-year-old female presented 30 minutes after Hampton's bite. On admission, there was moderate local swelling, whole blood protein time 20 negative. And then you repeated it after 1.5 hours later, which was positive. No bleeding manifestations. Now, then 2 hours later, repeat whole blood protein time 20 was done because you don't give antivenom for confirmed Hampton's bite patients. So you waited and after 2 hours did another whole blood protein time 20, which was positive. And this time INR was more than 30. So that is what the machine gives. Basically, it seems like there's no fibrinogen at all in the blood, right? And but still no bleeding. Now in this patient, if you really look at what happened, now if at 4 hours we get FFP, right? Sorry. Seems it's not possible. Yeah, so 4 hours we did whole blood protein time 20 and then give FFP, 1 dose. Waited for nearly 10 hours, still INR was high, given FFP, and again for another couple of days INR was very high. What is the reason? Yes. So in these patients, actually for research purposes, we were collecting blood samples on times in a time series, right? Then we actually look what happened in these patients. What happens was, now if you look at the first graph, which shows INR, change of INR according to the time, INR was unreportable now up to like 48 hours, right? Very high. Up 13 was in about 48 hours, sorry, over 24 hours. And then gradually it became normal. APTT, again, it took the same time to become normal. Fibrinogen levels was very low or zero at the beginning. And then it took 48 to 72 hours to become normal. So what happened to the FFP given by you? If you look at D dimers, the fourth one, every time you give FFP, D dimer levels go sky high. What happens? Because in Hampton-Zoe bites, you didn't give antivenom. Still, the active toxins are in the circulation. So by giving FFP, you are kind of fueling a fire. You give more FFP to be consumed. So it's entirely useless if you don't give antivenom early. For Russell's vipers, uncontrollable coagulopathy, like if you give enough antivenom early and then you can try FFP, there's no problem with that. But without giving antivenom, giving FFP is entirely useless. So FFP could be given for weak only after giving AVS. FFP without giving AVS is useless for weak. Right? And the last point is therapeutic plasma exchange for AKI with thrombotic microangiopathy. And I think there are much more experienced people here, like Dr. Dilitha, who has been managing patients like that. And but a recent study which published from Colombo suggests that therapeutic plasma exchange for AKI with TMA in viper bites have no beneficial effects compared to non-treating with therapeutic plasma exchange. Right? So there's no evidence at the moment. We need more research to be done. And the other, my personal concern is, if you give therapeutic plasma exchange, chances are high that you are removing more antivenom than venom itself, because it basically the whole point of plasma exchange is removing antibodies. So in a Russell's viper bite patient, what you do is basically load the central compartment with antivenom, and whatever the new toxins absorb into the circulation will be quickly trapped by the antivenom molecules. Now with TP, if you remove antivenom molecules, we don't know how it happens. So we need more research-based evidence for that. So basically that's it. And I thank my mentors and colleagues who have helped me a lot, because some of this information actually research-based ones. I just wanted to share with you to as a thought-provoking stimulant. And I thank KSM, especially the president as well as the secretary, for inviting me for this talk. And I really enjoyed this, especially Kandy is a special place for me, and this is the place where I hang around as a medical student for a long time. And I was sitting, when I see medical students, about 13 years ago, I was sitting like you here as a final year medical student. Now, so I'm really glad to see medical students as well. So thank you. So if you have any questions, please ask.
Anjali is giving an update on Jagan. Now, this is a paradoxical situation in the clotting cascade. You said on the other hand it clots, on the other hand it is bleeding. Is there an effect on the plasminogen by the venoms?
I think there are certain South American snakes that are actually acting on that. But widespread, like if you take most of the common snakes now in worldwide, I think coagulopathy is the major problem in like if you take the global picture, Russell's viper, saw scale vipers, and then some pit vipers in South American regions are the most important. So they are mainly acting via basically factor 5, 10, and prothrombin activators. But there are certain snakes, like there are some East Asian snakes, we call them rhabdophis. They have again some action on plasminogen activators. So if you look at the broad picture, sir, it's actually those toxins are not the major toxins that are considered as procoagulants, but there are a lot more other smaller sites of action by individual snakes.
I think I must thank Professor Anjana Silla. I think very wonderful evidence base and his own studies. Used several his own studies for the explanation of the various aspects of the snake bites. And Anjana was our recipient of the Candy Society of Medicine last year for KSM Research Prize. This is only one lifetime achievement, and he was so lucky. And then have the KSM Research Prize oration last year. And he's a product of ours as well, as he mentioned. And actually, I'm very happy that KSM we are organizing the different lectures on the different aspects. Every week, we are not going on the monotonous and type of lectures. We are giving the different aspects to make you more educated, more enlightened, as well as giving you the latest updates on knowledge on various aspects. And we conduct various workshops, as I'm telling every day here. And I think I'm inviting all of you to participate. Because we are going to have our foundation session next week, the next Wednesday, with the KSM Research Prize oration on the receivers of lung cancer, or the cancer, oral cancer. And we'll have a very good lecture series we have prepared on diabetes, hypertension, dengue, and cosmetics. So I'm inviting everyone to join with us next week on Wednesday, and listening to the oration as well as to listen to those lectures on the updates and the peptic ulcer disease. So these are the day-to-day practice what you need for diabetic hypertension, dengue, peptic ulcer disease, and to maintain your beauty. Particularly, ladies may be very interested to that lecture. To keep these are the latest updates. And we are having our health camp tomorrow. We are organizing KSM Health Camp, 4th health camp in my period in Madol Calais. Whoever will wish to join with us tomorrow can join. We are arranging everything in Madol Calais because we have to do some other work as well. Unfortunately, I could not able to come at the beginning because I was busy with some other meeting. Anyway, I'm thanking very much our speaker today, Professor Anjana Silla. He is giving the latest updates and knowledge on the snake bites. And he's one of the very good researcher. I'm very happy. I listened to him last year as well, his oration. And we expect that type of caliber, and he's a product of Peradini, and very, very happy to be here. Now, tradition, I'm a certificate to appreciate. I'm inviting Senior Professor of Physiology and our ex-dean, Professor Vajra Veerasinghe, to hand over the certificate of appreciation to Anjana for his lecture.
You are currently the only person in this conference.